Hello.
Hi.
Let's see if we even going to have a meeting today.
I guess that Ben told me that today he wanted to run the meeting to set the what's the name, to define the goals for the 0.3 release.
We also have to look at the backlog for this minor release that is to come. So how is the IPv6 stuff going on?
Well, the thing is, I have doubts about. So there are several things with the dual stack thing. I don't know how the thing is going to work out. And for IPv6, I don't know what's the best way to implement it, because I don't know if it's good to say to the user if they want to define if they want to deploy IPv6 or not, or just he should provide the network addresses and everything and kind figure out the configuration and set up the cluster.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. We have to settle on some sort of a UX for this, like what is the best option, and just go for it. I mean, to my understanding, there has to be some sort of field that says enable IPv6, and from there we have to automatically pick, like if the user sets some of the addresses to be IPv6, we should transparently support it. You know, they should add a single flag, like enable support for this, and possibly this way we can also have the dual stack working eventually.
I created a document with that approach, you know. So well, I don't know if I'm hijacking the session, and we should talk later because I see more people joining.
Yeah, let's start the recording after Ben switches accounts.
I mean, why limit it to dual stack? Why not triple stack, Lubomir? I'm joking. To be clear, I'm joking.
Yeah, I mean, we have to get the dual stack working first. I don't know what is the state of the proposed caps at the moment.
It's a stack.
Yeah, people are still trying to figure out how to support it in core components, to my understanding. So it's not only about kind or kubeadm, there are like some questions about the API server and stuff.
Well, the proposal basically added this field to say IP family, and with IP family you can define IPv4, IPv6, or dual stack, and kind should be validate that everything is correct and deploy the cluster. Because dual stack is not clear, I didn't know. I added the things that are in the cap, you know, that they suggest to use comma separated list for some fields.
The comma separated list sounds good to me. And if the user, since the picture of dual stack is not clear, if the user lists the two different stacks, maybe we should show some sort of warning or something like, hey, this is not fully supported yet.
Yeah, that's why I suggested to move all these parameters that depends on the IPv4 or IPv6 to the new API, so we can validate. After they configure, you need to configure there. We have the validation process of the function, and we can stop the creation of the cluster. Because if you send these parameters via the Cuban patches or the JSON patches, I don't know if we are able to run the validation there.
Hey, since Ben started recording it, Ben, do you need to say the thing that you say at the beginning of the recorded calls?
So I think these actually automatically start recording. So
Awesome.
FYI, this is a Kubernetes community meeting for sig-testing the Kind sub-project. This follows the CNCF, our Kubernetes Code of Conduct, which basically boils down to don't be a jerk. And this will be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, FYI. Oh, hello everyone. I see we have a few things on the agenda from Fabrizio today. I also neglected to put this on the agenda, but I'd like to discuss the next release and what we want to put in that, what everyone's focusing on. So,
I didn't put it on the agenda, but if we have time, Ben, I would like to discuss the tar build.
Yeah, I'm a bit behind on that PR currently, but let's do that. Fabrizio, do you want to go ahead with your topics? They look pretty well prepared.
Yes, even if the first topic most overlaps with the planning. So it was discussed some time ago that we want to use Kind for testing Kubernetes upgrades. Just to give a quick background to the people that maybe don't know what is the problem, is that as of today, there is no signal for Kubernetes upgrade except something really GKE oriented. And we want to have a better signal for the ecosystem, for Kubernetes, and also because this is a blocker for graduating HA in Kubernetes, which is something that was already punted from V114, but we want to achieve the next cycle.
Which thing is a blocker for HA? Just having CI signal for it?
No.
Or specifically upgrades?
We want to have a CI signal for HA covering the whole life cycle. So from create to upgrade. Otherwise, we are covering only a bit of the story. So upgrade is part of the HA signal.
I would question that slightly, given that upgrade hasn't been blocking for other functionality. I think upgrade is maybe a sort of a separate beast to tackle from the HA functionality itself working.
Okay, like, we can see as a different piece, but at the end, what we need to test init, join, and upgrade for single cluster, init, join, and upgrade for HA cluster. So at the end, they are somehow related. So
I would also note that. So I do really think we should do this, but I also want to go ahead and voice my concern just that if we're going to say like we need upgrade testing to be done to verify HA, the actual upgrade workflow is not going to be the same on, like if I have some machine somewhere running Ubuntu, I'm going to do like a package update and that sort of thing. And that workflow is going to be different from our like scripted upgrade on Kind. So if it is coverage for that.
Let me say that, okay. Testing upgrade is a priority, P0. As soon as we can test upgrade, we want to test upgrade also for HA cluster, because you have to test the machinery that upgrades the secondary control plane nodes, which is different than the machinery that upgrades the first control plane node.
Sure. I just want to say, as much as I love testing everything with Kind, having done some upgrades recently, there's some important steps that are they look different with like a production release and packages and an actual machine versus Kind.
Would it be
So I am just a little wary of like kind solves all of our problems because
No, I agree
I
with
just
you.
want to make sure that like that's on the record somewhere that like
Would it be
I'm
helpful?
not pretending that this solves everything.
Ben, would it be helpful? And it'd be helpful to me at least. Fabrizio, have you outlined what constitutes grade that you're looking to test? Is it purely with something like kubeadm?
Yes, Kubernetes. Yes, but I try to answer to both. So I agree that upgrade is a complex sequence, and in real production clusters, there's some quirks or some tricks that it is difficult to test. But currently now we have no signal. So having some signal is much better than now.
Right. We should absolutely do this. I just wanted to be clear that, you know, hopefully that's not the final state. Hopefully we also get some other signal covering these things with real clusters, particularly for CI signal where like it's not as much of a big deal to have some, you know, expensive cloud resources comparatively. Ideally, we can also ensure that someday we have other testing besides kind.
Yes, I'm expecting that, for instance, I'm expecting that some folks that is doing cluster API, as soon as Kubernetes HA graduates to beta, they support beta and they test upgrades. But it is a kind of, if we don't reach beta, they don't adopt it, and so on and so on and so on. Okay. So this is the background. The other piece of the background is that Kubernetes Anywhere, which was the tool that was used in the past to test upgrade, is not an option anymore. So kind is the most concrete option we have on the table today. And and this is the background. So the context is that, and then I think that we should plan a meeting to focus on this. The context is that we have two different layers of problems. One layer is that kubetest and this new version, which is kubetest 2, somehow should be stretched to support the upgrade scenario.
Why is upgrade going to be part of the up sequence? That doesn't make any sense to me.
No, let me try to get there. This is just only food for discussion, so it's not the definitive solution, first of all. So my starting point is that kubetest now execute up, test, and down. Okay, those are the three macro phases that we can play on. That means that one viable option is to fit upgrades in one of these three phases. So we have two options: or we stretch the meaning of one of these three phases for getting upgrade in, or we add new phases.
I mean, so we're testing upgrades, so the test phase. I mean, so the other idea is that the part of the reason that they're in different steps is that you can run like an up, and then you can come and do a test, and then you can tear it down. And you may not choose to tear down when you up and test, and you may choose to up and then test for some reason. Maybe you want to do something else, some other kind of testing first before you run the test.
And this is the point that I want to complete this. So any idea, suggestion to make this work and happen this cycle is very welcome. You are an expert on the test infra.
So I will say, when you say cycle, do you mean this release cycle? Like
yes.
Kubernetes release cycle, which is much longer than release cycle.
Kubernetes release cycle, but according to Lubomir, which is my guru for testing, is that we needed to have this in 1 month and a half in order to be to don't miss the milestone. So we are under a little bit of pressure. We feel the pressure.
I don't think we're going to have anything I don't think we're going to have a lot of progress on Cube Test 2 in this month. It's not a priority for me. I know it's going to come up as a somewhat of a priority for one of my teammates for some other testing purposes, but that's probably not until at some point in like actually in Q2, and I can't make any promises about what velocity they'll make on that. Cube Test 2 is really a nice to have. It's not like it hasn't been a blocker for anything yet.
And so I don't want to, let me say, make this meeting Kubernetes focused. So my proposal is that we table the discussion in separate meeting, but
Okay.
In this meeting there are people who can help. So I wanted to share this goal.
Can I say something at the end of this, please? So I know these constraints of what we can do and what we cannot do, and what are the priorities of testing for us as well, and kind as a tool. So, Tim Sinclair wants phases and stuff, and kind. We want Cube Test 2 to be a Swiss Army knife and stuff like that. But the reality is that if you want to get a signal in 115, we basically started planning on Kinder, the other tool, as a backup plan for this. And also, the tool itself, we have to execute it directly from a script without completely bypassing Cube Test, the same way you are doing, Ben, currently with the regular bash script that you execute in the jobs, So using this mechanic, we can implement whatever we want, upgrades or not. The concern from Fabrizio and Timothy is that we fragment the two projects. At the same time, I do not think that this is a big concern because we only implement a separate front end. The back end remains the same.
Yeah, I'm not terribly concerned about that. I think if we find that anything will be generally useful beyond Kubernetes testing, we can hopefully backport it to the back end.
We can definitely.
I would go that route. I would also add, though, that script that we're using for kind testing today is 100% legacy and is not really meant to be like the pattern. It's a pattern and probably the easiest way to get started. But I would recommend to everyone to write a well-defined program, probably closer to say Kinder as opposed to like an ever-growing script.
Yes, basically the plan, which is quite alpha in this stage, is that we pretty much execute stuff from the job as a bash script, and the bash script pretty much wraps a binary immediately. Mm-hmm. So there's no bash anywhere. At least that's the plan, at least.
Okay, well, I think all this is fine. I will also add that phases specifically is something that I plan to, as we go into point 3 planning, that's something I plan to land very early. But I don't think that like upgrade as an up phase, I think upgrade's going to need to be like just some totally separate concept from those. Because like phases are going to be some kind of like alpha or experimental thing that kind offers up as part of up. And not necessarily particularly extensively, but even just logistically from a testing perspective, you should probably ensure that the cluster came up healthy and then do upgrade and then do more. So I would put upgrade into the testing cycle of like, this is one of the things we're going to do to the cluster as we test it, as opposed to like immediately when you bring it up.
Also, it's unclear. We don't have a phase. Like, where is the upgrade phase? Like you say, we don't have a dash upgrade. So we have to define really where is the upgrade phase into test.
I would say it should be part of the like Kubernetes Kinder like testing cycle. You take an existing kind cluster and you do some kind of upgrade test thing, and that can include upgrading.
Yes, so we first upgrade then test. But to be able to do that with the current kind front end, we have to pretty much call test CMD at this point, right?
I mean, so we also don't have upgrade in the kind front end to begin with.
Yes, so we have
So
to.
it could just as well. And I would also, just from a perspective of like making sure the tests are good, I would also go ahead and recommend that maybe not like the end-to-end test, but some kind of limited smoke test be run as the first part of the upgrade test, and then the actual upgrade, and that itself as a test does upgrading work, and then do things work after upgrade, you can run the normal test suite.
I sent up here. I'm implementing kubeadmin end-to-end test as a separate set of tests focused on this. So I agree.
And
to be able to call these tests, we also have to call Gink Go specifically. They are outside of the suite, you know. So it creates another complication. We have to call them from somewhere.
yeah, I mean, so you could even have something like you call your test program and maybe your test program calls Ginkgo, or maybe you don't want to implement calling Ginkgo, so your test program calls kubetest, and like that's relatively fine. The Ginkgo testing can kind of be its own isolated chunk of this, and I don't think the particular abstraction for that matters that much right now.
Yeah, because we are entering the land of too much bash in a test CMD, I think the decision to use kinder as an early implementation for this is the way to go in 1.15.
Okay, that makes sense to me. Okay, so I want to take a slight diversion and just real quick toss out the list of things that I'm looking at roughly in priority order for me. I'm going to add these to the doc as well. So as far as point 3 is concerned, I've been looking at the requests I'm getting from everyone and also the usage cases that I know of. And I think these are roughly the things that will fit in about a month's time frame, and not necessarily all of them will land, but definitely the top ones at the priority should. I think we really need phases to unblock some local development of Kubernetes. Getting the multi-node local dynamic volume stuff in seems like a real win for various use cases and shouldn't be particularly problematic. We've had people testing this for a while now without it being integrated, but manually deploying this. We already have a PR for building from a release tarball, and I think that's gonna, thank you, Andrew. I think that's going to save some CI headache so that we don't have to do quite as much expensive building of Kubernetes. And we also don't have to necessarily worry about publishing images, because it will make it cheaper and easier to build an image from a particular CI tarball without actually doing the Kubernetes build. So that will let us patch over that a little bit. Traffic serving is kind of a nebulous one. I'm not pinning that down to anything in particular, but just making it easier to do tests where you have something on your host talk to something running in your kind cluster. I've seen a lot of use cases blocked on that. We have a couple of options. We should look more at that and try to get one.
Well, wasn't there some issue or PR where somebody suggested, or at least put forward, the allowing a customization of exposed ports?
Yeah, there's
several options, right?
Yeah, there's a couple options there. Basically, just exploring that some more and possibly getting one of them in. I do think this is blocking some use cases that otherwise fit kind very well. This one is not user facing for the most part, but finishing abstracting away Docker. We've still got some various pieces of the code that do things like pass flags to Docker as just strings and things like that, and that's going to bite us later as we keep trying to add features or we want to support Podman and so on. So I have some partial work on this left over. I'd like to finish this. It's not super high priority, but I think it's important that we have well-defined interfaces. This will also leave us open the option in the future of if we want to use like an in-process Docker client as opposed to shelling out to Docker. It will also make it easier for us to support special modes with container runtime. Like maybe we find that we need to do things slightly different if we start trying to support remote Docker. And if we have our own interface for I want to make calls to Docker on the host for talking to the node containers fully as a thing that's injected all the way through, then it'll be easy for us to do, okay, well, this one's actually the remote Docker one that does things slightly differently, or this one's the Podman one, or that sort of thing. But instead of having to make all of the code aware of like one or the other, we're going to put this behind interface and as much as possible target container runtime-ish types, so that someday we can even support things like you're running cryo on your host and you want to create a kind cluster against it. Sure. Not
Okay.
the highest priority, but just a code cleanup thing.
To be super clear, I thought so. This is talking about the CRI that is used to run the node containers. And you made a statement, and I'm not going to hold you to it for ad infinitum, but I think you made a statement with respect to internally, there's no promise that it will use Docker to run the pods, but externally, the thing that will run the nodes, at least for the foreseeable future, with no plans to change, you said was Docker. So you're just
no. So that is by far the most important and common one, but leaving it open where we're not tied at the hip
sure
to that is super useful. And we've been making progress in that case. Podman is the easiest one because it mimics Docker, but right now it's pretty ugly to plumb through and try to make everything use Podman instead.
No, I get where you're going.
Yeah.
I should
the other reason is just for mocking and things later for making this testable.
I'll follow
we have this.
We
have an issue tracking this, and we actually have this mostly separated, but it's not a clean split right now. Things like doing exec to the nodes is pretty separated today.
Yeah, that's actually what I posted that last Friday night, like at 8. I'm pretty thoroughly using, Docker exec to mimic, SSHing into nodes. And so if they're going to support more than just Docker, I want to make sure that either that has the ability to exec into nodes, or we consider what I suggested, which is being able to add information to the nodes in Kubernetes that pulls data from the nodes operating system.
So you as a kind user should always be able to use Docker on the host. If you'd like to also use this additional stuff, you might need to port to it. We already today have library tooling you can use in kind for I want to get a list of all the nodes and then I want to be able to take actions against the nodes, like run commands on them. And that today calls Docker exec, but that is wrapped under an abstraction. There's some other points where things like, say, creating the nodes are not themselves as abstracted as we'd like that nodes package knows things about Docker that it probably shouldn't, as opposed to just I want to make a node container. Things like the ports, instead of using CRI's port mapping type, it actually just passes Docker port flags directly. I'd like to eliminate that sort of thing in favor of there's a set of packages that understand Docker, and that's where we have the connection there, and from that point we can slice out to do a mock one, or we can do Podman or whatever. But that's not important. So next least important, exploring containerd on the nodes, not on the host, because I think testing Kubernetes with CRI is a good point. Containerd also appears to take less resources than running all of Dockerd. Potentially we can ship a lighter image that way. And the node Kubernetes lifecycle is moving towards being on the CRI path all the time. So I want to look at, can we take the containerd we already ship underneath Dockerd and use that as the runtime on the node? And that will also help us shake out some things where stuff is also depending inherently on Docker on the node. And I see that one is actually long-term more important than the host, because then you can do things like use cryo and a custom image. And there's going to be plenty of use cases for testing that for like the integration of these Kubernetes pieces. That said, it's below. I personally think it's below the abstract away Docker thing for now, just because the abstract away Docker thing for now helps us isolate the pieces of our code that are doing, hacky Docker exec stuff, and that's going to help us do like better testing for ourselves and things like that. But from a user perspective, long term, I think it's less interesting to say like, oh, we might be able to use cryo on the host. There's actually possibly some weird problems with that for things we do with the nodes, but for that's more aspirational. But there's absolutely no reason we shouldn't be able to run like containerd or cryo or whatever on the node, except that right now we're increasingly growing code that like expects Docker, like the proxy configuration. And the last one that's just somewhere in there that I honestly expect someone else will tackle is node restart. We're seeing users that are perhaps they're using their laptops and they're coming back and the Docker daemon's been restarted and they still have this kind cluster around and they want to be able to restart it as opposed to creating a new cluster. Initially, the argument was, well, you should just make a new cluster. These are supposed to be cheap and not stateful. But there's been a few points around things like, well, I needed to pull some third-party images to my cluster, and that's time-consuming. And it will be a more straightforward win to add restart support than to optimize away pulling third-party images. It's difficult to it's going to be difficult, a lot of testing flows to catch that.
Can we just bind mount in the storage for the images into the nodes?
Yes and no. Not really for recreating new ones. Docker's graph format is not meant to be shared. It might be possible to use this. The other thing is, it might be possible. It's definitely not something you're supposed to do, and it's a very unexplored area. And depending on like the graph driver, I think it may be more problematic than others.
Gotcha.
The other thing you could do is you could say like, oh, well, you need to pull them to your host, and then you can do like a kind load image or something. But that requires them to know all the images ahead of time, which is more painful when the thing you're testing depends on somebody else's manifests with somebody else's images. So like say I'm deploying like Istio to my kind cluster, and then I'm going to run some tests on something I've built that depends on Istio. It's possibly a little bit much to expect that user to go through and figure out what are all the images in the manifest and pull them to their host and load them into their cluster. It should be relatively simple for us to have something that restarts the containers properly for the nodes. So I wanted to ask if anybody had anything else that they thought was important that we should have.
I have a question.
Sorry. IPv6 is not part of this minor release.
I did not put it there. I thought that might be a tad ambitious. I think we can. I think we should get work towards it. I don't know if we should say like we're definitely going to have it working. Some things that I think we still need more time to design too, like this CNI abstraction, where you want to be able to configure that. I think we should absolutely have work towards it. I don't know if we should declare that we're going to, that like we want like working IPv6. Because the other thing that I noticed is a common trend of like anytime we're making any changes to the rest of the node logic, we're making that IPv6 PR rebase. So I think we might need to break it up into like, we're gonna fix pieces of it and lay down some of the tooling and things to start making the code aware to not assume IPv4 all over the place. But I'd like it to not block things like, say, refactoring for phases or something. I don't think they will clash, but we have a lot of other like almost there things, and I'd like to make these releases shorter.
Okay.
Which I guess that's something we didn't explicitly talk about here, but we have brought up in the past. I think about a month is where we've roughly been at, but like slipping a little bit. I'd like to actually tighten it up to actually about once a month for the minor releases, possibly faster once we stop breaking things. But as long as we are like making breaking API changes, I don't want to say like once a week, because then we won't have time to like introduce an API and make some behavioral changes. But I also don't think we should take as long as the Kubernetes release. We have a lot more velocity for such an earlier project.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Don't worry. It's just I need more or less have a timeline in my.
Okay, so Ben, the next release is planned for?
So originally it's listed out as a month from when we planned point 2. I think we should move it to a month from when point 2 happened. Which was
end of April, beginning of May.
Mm-hmm. And just start doing like monthly minor releases until we think we're going to switch the API to beta and stop allowing breaking changes.
So in the current list that you posted in Slack, have you thought about establishing priorities for these items?
That order is roughly the order.
Aha.
So node restart, I will say, is weird. I don't think that one is high priority, but I think it's actually much more likely to get in than the other ones because it's such a small change, potentially.
Have you encountered interest from SIG-Node people like Lentao and Yuju about containerd support?
Not as much. That's more of a completeness thing on our end. Like people have asked for cryo, for example. And I think containerd is an easier route for us to start exploring, because once we add cryo, we're definitely going to have to deal with like the base image being different, but we can actually do some exploration of containerd with images we've already published, hopefully.
Okay.
I think it really depends on who you talk to. In general, they're less interested in this. SIG-Node is painfully aware of like needing to test things in actual environments that look like production.
Because this is going to be a very high priority for them if they realize the potential in kind, but they're probably busy with other stuff.
They're the other stuff. I can ask them questions if we need. Yuju and Lanto actually work on my building on this floor, a couple seats down. So I have asked them a few questions about this, but I'm definitely not pushing it for their use case. I honestly expect that they probably won't use it.
So you want to finish phases as the first item in a month?
So not necessarily finish, but ship something. I think we've, so if you look at how our bring up is today, I think we've relatively stabilized these things, and it's probably okay to expose some kind of experimental or alpha flag to create that says like, this is the steps I want taken. And we can do some cleanup to try to make sure that they're reentrant, so that if you run like 3 of the steps and then you run another step, that other step will be able to rediscover all the information. I think we're relatively there.
Okay. Might be a good idea to start moving these items into the milestone, because currently I see only a couple of...
I didn't want to put them into the milestone without discussing.
Okay, so if you ask me, phases is a pretty good one. Mode to node workload dynamic balance. This was requested. Yes, it's a good one. The Tarbao stuff, Fabrizio and Andrew want this for sure. Traffic serving. Were there more than one request about traffic serving?
Yeah, so depending on your use case today, there's various workarounds, but doing it portably and reliably hasn't been good. And I've got a number of projects blocked on this, so I will personally be looking into this, but I'm not going to make it like block the release. Like if we get to 0.3 and this isn't baked yet, I'm not going to worry about shipping it, but it's something I'm going to be looking at.
I wanted to revisit the priority of the Tarball one. I don't know if Fabrizio wanted it so much as he was just involved in the commenting. Great feedback on the PR. If I'm the only one that wants it, I kind of responded to Ben pointing it out to me, and I do find it useful, but it's not something that I'm blocked on either.
I think we need this. We are starting to have more CI jobs for Kubernetes, and they're duplicating building Kubernetes. And despite the Bazel cache, that still consumes considerably more resources. So we can't make these, like we can make the pods and the tests cheaper if we don't actually need to build Kubernetes. And we like a normal Kubernetes CI job depends heavily on the fact that you can spin up a cluster from these tarballs. So if we can make it closer to that equivalent. Originally, the plan was we were going to have a CI job that pushed kind images, but there's some logistics with that, and we already have a job that pushes tarballs. So if we have kind build from tarballs, we can tell everyone that's doing a CI job, either use a stock kind image or build from a tarball, please. And
yeah, I'm already using
building from reserve building from like Bazel or like the make files or something for pre-submits. Kubernetes pre-submits specifically, and even kind pre-submits can potentially switch to downloading one of the CI channels instead of building. That one's a little bit iffier since we do need to test kind itself. Building, but like an average project should be able to test a recent Kubernetes snapshot without having to build Kubernetes. And this is probably the most viable way to unblock that for now.
Okay.
So I would say that to me, the Tarball build is probably higher priority than the rest of the items.
Yeah, that ordering is very approximate. I would say that, that one's, I think that one, the reason I put it a little bit lower is because the other two actually are probably less design and work. We already have it broken into phases internally. We just need to expose a mapping somewhere. And Fabrizio already had like a reasonable plan for that before. We can have like a command line flag with a like comma separated list. We just need to reintroduce that now that we've kind of negotiated some of the stability stuff and that we've refactored these things for a while now and it's relatively stable what the steps are. I think that may change slightly as we have to deal with, like, say, installing a provisioner for volumes or something like that. So it's actually one more question I have for this group. The local dynamic volumes. So that one trends into kind of iffy territory where, like, what is a minimum viable kind cluster? But I looked around and I think pretty much everyone's Kubernetes like distribution or deployment has working dynamic volumes. I think we should probably bundle that one as a default enabled thing so that we have a default storage class that actually works. We can do the host path storage class, which is built in. The downside of that is it won't work when people make multi-node, or rather it will kind of work, but not correctly.
It's a question if somebody is able to do it this kind cycle.
I mean, I will do this, but it's more of a like, well, you're going to need some kind of boundary here where, for example, someone requested the metric server. I'm not sure if that's something we definitely should ship. That kind of seems into iffy territory of like, you could install this yourself if you're needing it, but the volume one seems like a blocker for a lot of like any sort of testing where the thing you're testing needs storage. They're going to request just like the default storage class for a lot of simple testing, and ours right now doesn't really work.
I mean, you can draw the line for such important core API objects. Like you can say, okay, we are going to encode this because this is important for a lot of people. But things like, the metric server and stuff like that, this is definitely a customizable part of a certain user's cluster, and it's not important for everyone.
Right. The way I'm looking at it right now is if I were shipping, say, Ben's edition of GKE or something like that, like you click a button, you get a cluster, it's going to have things. The things that can't be customized that need to ship are like the storage class. Like if I'm going to run a cluster on vSphere, I need the vSphere storage out of the box. It's pretty useless without that. So I think having the local provisioner is like our closest thing to that. Whereas say like the dashboard is totally up to your use case and not actually integrated into deploying the cluster necessarily.
I think this is a very nice addition, and I'm sure that it's not going to meet any objections.
Okay. Well,
on the metrics or some other server, is there anything like that would be blocked on the exposed ports, or does that just come through the API server?
That one's a bit of a special case we need to revisit. So there's actually a separate thing with that where it's being configured in a similar way to some other Kubernetes components, and it's preferring the host names. But that one, you run it in the cluster, not on the host. So it's on the cluster network, so it doesn't need any special.
No, I knew that, but I meant the tests specifically. Would there be any tests people would be executing from the host?
Oh no, they should be things like kubectl top.
Okay, gotcha.
They should be able to do this via the API server, and that should be pretty normal. It's an in-cluster service.
Gotcha.
I don't think it's normal to expose the metrics server as like a public port or something like that.
I don't think in general we shouldn't support them. You should draw the line. And yeah.
Okay. So we still have a couple of agenda items. We have the dual stack support is really interesting, and there's a pretty detailed doc for this. If you haven't seen it, I request that you review it. I took a pass over it. I think we might, bike shed a few things about the configuration, but like generally this makes sense and is something that we want. It's another area where we just don't have CI testing because no one has like a CI cluster for this.
Yeah, I posted a comment about the labels we want to use eventually. IPv4 separated by IPv6. And possibly the dual stack in this case is not needed because if you have both of them, this already implies dual stack. I'm talking about the IP family field.
I think the upshot to dual stack is that some of your other code is simpler because it can just compare against the actual value.
True, but then again, we can have a
because you could have IPv4 or IPv6, and you could have a comma or I think that one's not important. Probably the thing that I think needs the most input is the CNI config. Right now it looks like that's just a URL to a manifest. I think we might want to make that a structure with some options where you can maybe have even like an inline manifest or a path to a manifest, and possibly like
images, pre-pulled images.
Maybe, but if we're creating the cluster, they won't actually be pre-pulled unless this is going to be added to a baked kind image.
Wouldn't that be a default? And wouldn't the CNI, like if there was no same default like Weave, then just be part of the phases approach where it was in the adding the overlay network? Because right now it's just bound to Weave, but I imagine that gets just changed to some default. And
Well, so there's two issues. This would be the actually applying the manifest would, but there's also getting the images into the cluster. So I think
that depends on the manifest.
yeah. So we might well, so like let's say you want to do this offline or locally, we might need to add some not even CNI specific support for saying when you do bring up I want these images to be side loaded. Or something like that. Because alternatively, you have to build a custom node image with this. This is for I have a node image and I want this configuration will let you say I want it to come up in dual stack mode and I want it to use this alternate CNI. That said, I also think the CNI might not be a blocker if we can get some more exploration of just picking a CNI that works for this. Because it looks like all the examples here, we're just going to use Calico. Possibly we just switch to Calico and then IPv6 work isn't actually blocked on that. That said, that's another thing where like I would like to explore it, but I don't know if I want to commit myself to getting in this cycle.
I will take it, Ben. I will explore Calico.
Okay. I mean, so if we can
so if we can define a standard CNI plugin, we can forget about the CNI option, no?
Right. Yeah. So, and that may be, if we can find, if that, like, if for example, Calico works and good enough for us, then that may be simpler than solving some of these. Because there are other issues like how do we get the images preloaded, and we have nice options for that right now for the pre-built ones. But doing this at cluster boot time may be. I think it's something we should eventually support, but it may need a little bit of thought, like how do you specify the images, or like should they actually just be built in? Or
the other option is to add the unsecure registry, you know, but I don't know if it's overcomplicating too much.
Well, but so specifically for CNI, because you're bringing this up during the cluster bring up, even like that doesn't exactly work, because you have a chicken and egg problem with like, okay, how are you going to have the in-cluster registry before you have CNI up?
Yeah.
CNI is a bit, whereas if this were like, I want to test my application, I'd say, okay, get the cluster up, load the images in yourself, then test the app. And that should be fine today with the tooling we have. But for things that are part of kind itself coming up, that's trickier. If you think we can get a Calico switch in earlier, that would be great, so that we can, test that out a bit before we actually release.
Okay.
And if we do that, that might unblock some things. I would appreciate that.
Yeah, I will take it.
Maybe we can say IPv6 is only supported with this CNI and nothing else.
Right. We can say that like it won't work properly with like older published kind images or something, and that's I think fine for now, since it's an opt-in feature and an alpha type.
But I do like the idea of exposing this into the config, some sort of a custom CNI.
I do think it is worth exposing in the config. I don't know that it's necessarily worth blocking everything on it right now. Because I also think it's something that we want to think about. Like we're probably that one's gonna need more design of like, what does it look like? Like, I don't think just putting the URL is actually going to be super viable long term. I think that's like one option, but there's also like local manifests or like the images considerations, and so like I think it's something we should get. But if we can just say that like Calico is great, it's going to support IPv6 too, we just switch, we can revisit the CNI options and focus more on I think probably the more interesting task for us here, which is getting IPv6 up. I think that testing will work better, and there are workarounds today for like, I want to test my CNI. In that case, you can take a kind image and you can put your manifest in it, and that works pretty well if you're specifically focused on testing CNI.
The way I tested different CNIs is I basically had to modify the source code. That was the easiest path. I basically modified the.
You can also You can also use a node mount, which doesn't require any modifications.
Yeah, that
But
works.
won't have the images preloaded.
You also have to think about batching changes in the config. What is doable in this release? Because multiple changes to the config are going to happen. And you have to think, like, apart from the phases field, what else can we batch for this cycle?
Well, so phases is also one that I would say doesn't belong in config. It'll probably be a command line flag that is optional, because if you're describing your cluster, the phase that you take it through is orthogonal. You're going to use the same cluster configuration for all of the phases. So it's kind of similar to name, in that like the name of the cluster is orthogonal to the configuration of the cluster.
It depends on what approach you want to take with the phases. Currently in kubeadm, we support skipping a phase, but that's a single flag and a phase, a list of phases that you want to skip. It's not a single one; it's multiple, but it's a list of skippable phases.
I will say then I think we can at least start with in sort of like a alpha or experimental flag, and we can potentially add it to config later. But for the case of like, I want to test kubeadm, just having it exposed in any form should be sufficient to move forward.
Phases in kind in general, they are not only about testing kubeadm, because people, if you have a phase that provisions the nodes but does not run the Kubernetes cluster, that, to my understanding, was a fairly popular feature request.
I think that's still only for a few rather specific use cases, and in those cases it should be fine to like use a flag or import kind as a library and do it there or something. For like the broad cross section of kind users, these phases are things like kubeadm and init, which they really shouldn't be worried about.
Yeah, I mean, people are going to use the phases in a different ways. I'm still not clear what phases are we going to expose, but yeah.
Provisioning the node and then the actions.
So the CNI installation is.
It needs to be broken out.
Yeah, it has to be after init immediately.
Well, let's come back to that. So we still have like a tiny bit of time. We had a new person join today that wanted to talk about migrating from Minikube. I'm happy to stay over time a bit if we need more time to talk about that.
Hey, hi. Good to meet y'all. Thank you for your work on this project. So far, very useful for me. I'm a contractor that's getting people into Docker and containerization and Kubernetes, and have been using Minikube as kind of the development environment for that, as many people do. I'm looking into kind as the replacement for that on developer laptops, and I'm wondering what words of caution, if any, there are. Obviously, I have the issue with the local storage thing, which we're talking about today. But besides that, it seems to work for local testing in general.
So on Mac and Windows in particular, if you want to have a service that serves traffic and then you want to talk to that from the host, right now you pretty much have to use like kubectl port forward or kubectl proxy.
Okay.
Because the nodes themselves are containers and they're not binding arbitrary ports from the container to the host outside of the like Docker for Mac VM. So I think Minikube has some special tooling for this, and we don't currently. You have to use like kubectl proxy. On Linux, this is less of a problem. You should be able to talk to the containers over the bridge network. That I think is one of the biggest ones. Yeah, I guess like for example, also Minikube has I think like this built-in concept of add-ons for various things. We don't have that. So if you want to like toggle an add-on via flag, you're going to have to actually install it to the cluster instead. I don't think that's a big blocker, but I do think the biggest blockers have been the storage thing and the network stuff where like I want to run like an HTTP server and send traffic to it from outside the cluster. You can, but depending on your environment, you may need to use something like kubectl port forward, which may not be the most ideal UX.
When you say
I'd
outside
like
the
to improve
cluster,
that.
you're including the host itself?
Yeah, so like I'm running kind, and then the next step I want to like run like curl some service in the cluster. If you're on like a Mac, that's not going to work. You're going to need to run something like kubectl port forward first.
Right.
I think we can add some support for this, but it may be tricky because the additional consideration that we have to make that makes this more awkward for us is that we support multiple nodes. So we can't just do something. We want to explore options besides like, let's just bind all of the ports that you could possibly have something on to the host, because it actually takes support on the host and passes it through the container. I'm going to be exploring options for that this cycle, but right now that has been a pain point for people that are using it like Minikube.
Got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm typically doing port forwarding when I'm doing local testing anyway. So
Okay.
I think it solves all my use cases. So I mean, I'll continue to kind of bug y'all if there's anything that comes up. But yeah.
Awesome. I will also add that like replacing Minikube for all use cases has not been like the first priority. I think we have a scoping doc now, and so like I do think it could work pretty well for that. But our first one is testing like Kubernetes. Like we want to test things like Kubernetes, and then we want to test applications on it. We want to do the Bootstrap clusters for the cluster API, and then anything else is just like a really nice to have. We think we can do it, but I don't think most of us are like, that's our, first and foremost. But this kind of stuff I think falls mostly pretty nicely under testing applications on Kubernetes, which is a second after testing Kubernetes itself.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you.
Cool. Did anyone else have anything else they wanted to say? We have actually gone over time, but I don't mind staying a bit longer.
I wanted to say that the network service mesh project is now using Kind as a Bootstrap cluster as well.
Oh, cool. What project exactly is that?
Network service mesh. It's you can find it in GitHub.
Is it this?
It's like a frog. The logo. Just a second. Yes, that's the one.
Cool. Thank you. I'm always interested to see what people are doing with this.
Yeah, it's one of our colleagues of mine. They're doing it. It's inspired by Istio and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Very cool. Well, if that's it, thank you all for coming and for all the input and everything. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.